Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. I'm Nikki Jovicic from LookUpStrata, and for today's session we're very happy to welcome Chris Irons from Strata Solve. This is a national webinar about self-managed strata. During the presentation, Chris will explain how self-management works and how it doesn't, as well as some tips on how owners, committees, contractors and managers can navigate their way through it. This will be followed by some discussion and some Q&As. And now Chris and I have collaborated on quite a few webinars and recorded sessions over the past few years. We've covered legislation changes for Queensland, we've examined smoking in strata, talked about the legalities of CCTV in body corporate buildings, and we've tackled a whole micro webinar series. But this is the very first time we've spoken about self-managed strata. So I'm delighted to welcome Chris Irons from Strata Solve. With an unmatched perspective on the strata sector, Chris Irons is a thought leader for strata issues and dispute resolution. For over 5 years, Chris was Queensland's Commissioner for Body Corporate and Community Management, the only role of its type in the world. After working for well-known strata law firm Hines Legal, Chris is now an independent strata consultant working under the banner of Strata Solve and helping clients to untangle their strata issues with tailored solutions. Chris brings to the table over 2 decades of leadership in public policy development and is a nationally accredited mediator. He is a frequent media and content contributor on strata issues. In his capacity as independent consultant, Chris is a senior vice president of the Board of Strata Communities Association in Queensland, and Chris is also the president of Northside Connect, a non-for-profit community and legal services provider based on Brisbane's North Side. Chris regularly assists our readers with answers to their tricky strata questions. He appears in our newsletters and monthly or bi-monthly editions of the Strata magazine and has authored or co-authored over 100 articles on the LookUpStrata blog. This content receives thousands of reads and therefore assists thousands of lot owners and strata managers every month. We thank Chris for his ongoing support and assistance to the LookUpStrata community, and welcome to today's webinar, Chris.
Thank you so much, Nikki. Thanks everyone also for making the effort to sort of tune in. Nikki and I both realise that there are a lot of options for people to get educated, get informed, attend events, attend webinars. So the fact that you're making the choice to attend ours, we really appreciate it. Thank you very much. As Nikki said, this is a bit of a new one on us. And I think Nikki and I were just talking before we started today about how it generated. And I think we had a series of questions, comments, discussion on the LookUpStrata blog about self-management. And it occurred to Nikki and I that there's something in that. Judging by the number of people attending today, there's definitely something in that. So today, I am going to attempt to sort of go through a little bit about what we mean by self-management in strata, some pros, some cons, and importantly, try and leave you with a few best practice tips. And those best practice tips, ideally, they'll serve you well whether you're self-managed or not. I think they're actually applicable in all cases. I'm now going to do the thing which makes me always nervous in these events and attempt to share screen. Stay tuned, everybody.
Thanks, Chris. I'm sure it will work as well as it did. There you go. It's come up straight away. That's fantastic.
It did work. All right. And I just want to reiterate a couple of points that Nikki raised there in the introduction. This is definitely not legal advice for you today. There is no substitute for obtaining qualified advice if you do need some assistance, and very happy to take questions. We've already had quite a few posed to us before the session today. Happy to take questions, and we'll try and get to as many of those as we possibly can. Prefer that you try and keep them on topic today, please, because there's probably going to be a lot of people involved. All right. This is maybe what I think people might ideally think of when we're talking about self-management, some kind of glorious utopia in which all of the competing strands are superbly balanced: finances, administration, maintenance, property management, improvement. That's the ideal. For many people, though, this is the reality of self-management. A whole lot of things going in a whole lot of places, a whole lot of different ways. That's not to be cynical about it, I guess, and that's not to be dismissive of it, but it can be difficult. So what are we going to talk about today? I'm just going to talk very briefly about self-management generally as a concept. Governments of different types have tried to grapple with that idea. We'll have a quick look at that. The pros, when it's good. But of course, if we're looking at pros, then we have to look at cons as well. And surprise, surprise, there are actually more than a few of those in this space. I'm going to talk about whether or not I think self-management, or we think self-management, is a bit of a utopia. And then, like I said, probably most importantly out of today, a bit of best practice. And as I say, I would hope that the best practice tips that we give out today are actually relevant, self-management or not. And then, as I say, some opportunity for questions. All right, so let's look at the conceptual basis for self-managed strata. So the extract that you're seeing now on screen comes from Queensland's Body Corporate and Community Management Act 1997, Section 4A to be precise. I am an expert in Queensland's strata legislation. I'm not really an expert in other states' legislation. So when I do speak on strata issues, it will be from that Queensland perspective, but I think you'll find that a lot of the concepts translate across borders anyway. So here is the Queensland government's attempt to articulate self-managed strata. And you can see there that they've actually used the phrase self-management. And so from that, you can, I think, quite reasonably interpret that Queensland's Parliament, at least at one point in time, thought that strata schemes would essentially be self-managed. It says their inherent aspect. To me, that means that the idea from Parliament at the time was that, yes, you might rely upon some assistance every now and then, but ultimately it's up to the people in the scheme, the owners, to manage the scheme for themselves. Noting, of course, that that act is now over 25 years old and has not been substantially amended. It's been amended in little ways, but it's not been substantially amended in that time. You can draw your own conclusions about how relevant those concepts are these days. I did a very quick scour of some other jurisdictions' research for this presentation, and one of the extracts I've got there is from New South Wales Strata Schemes Management Act. The Owners Corporation for a strata scheme has the principal responsibility for management of the scheme. So that's slightly different to the Queensland one. And it says that effectively what the New South Wales Parliament is saying there is that, again, there might be any number of options to assist the strata scheme exercise its responsibilities, but ultimately responsibility always sheets back to the owners, the people who comprise the owners corporation. Two different ways of expressing self-management. We'll delve into that a bit more as we go along. So from that, and thinking about it very generally, then here's where I think the concepts of self-management are at. Regardless of which state or territory you're in, each owner has rights and responsibilities which go towards managing the scheme. A good example of that would be the general concept that the owner is responsible for everything which occurs within their boundaries, their lot. That's their responsibility. And then things which occur in the common property is the body corporates or the stratas or the owners corporation's responsibility. That's a very general statement. There are a lot of exceptions and a lot of nuances in that, but that's concept one. And then concept two, the committees are the day-to-day managers, the day-to-day doers. They are the ones who make decisions that carry out the will of the owners. I know that people who might have heard me speak before know that I like to make the comparison between strata and politics. And I'm sorry to introduce politics at this point, but I'm going to do it nonetheless. If you think about it, if you compare strata to the Australian Parliament, for example, think of it this way. All of the different members of Parliament, I think it's 153, they're the lot owners, effectively. And then from the Parliament, you have a cabinet, and the cabinet is the body which is tasked for executing things, getting things done, deciding things. They are the smaller subset, the elected or the appointed subset of the broader set. In strata, you have all of the owners, and then the smaller elected and appointed subset is the committee, which is responsible for the day-to-day management. So that's the two basic concepts. And then after that, pretty much things are up for grabs. Self-management goes off in different directions at that point. But those are the two basic concepts. Owners have rights and responsibilities. Committees have rights and responsibilities. And importantly, committees have limitations on their powers. So when we speak about self-management, what are the good points of it? There are a few. One of the obvious ones is cost savings. If you're not engaging a strata manager and you're not engaging other kinds of contractors, there is an obvious cost saving for you. And yes, I do realise there's a flip side to that. We will be looking at the flip side in a second. Arguably, there are some reduced hassles when we talk about self-management. If all of the owners are looking after their affairs themselves, then ideally, and I stress ideally, those hassles should be reduced. I think self-management contributes to a greater sense of control from those owners. And I know I've spoken to a lot of different owners over the years, and I think for those people who don't necessarily have somebody appointed, be it an on-site manager, caretaker, other contractor, they tend to feel like they have a better control over the situation and thus a better control over their investment. It's an interesting one. It's a very nuanced kind of discussion, and I guess that goes more towards human behaviour than anything else. And very strongly related to that is that self-management provides a very tangible sense of ownership and participation. So I have bought into this scheme. I own my lot. I'm protecting my property investment. If we're self-managing, then I can see a very tangible link between me and participation in those outcomes that I want. And those outcomes are always the same. It's protection of the investment. One of the other ways that self-management is a good thing is that it helps you keep a low profile. If all that you want and if all that the scheme wants is just to get on, do the basics, get the minimum done, make sure the minimum amount of responsibilities are carried out, self-management might be a good thing. Self-management might also be a good thing for keeping a low profile in the sense that you might have a better chance of staying out of the public limelight or out of the media if you're a self-managed scheme. That usually is the way it goes. Not always, but usually. Of course, when there are pros, there have to be cons. And let's just say there are a few of them in this case. First one, the biggest one, in fact, it's so important that I've underlined it. Strata is complex, difficult, technical stuff. Think about it this way. In Strata, you've got this very weird mix of property, legal concepts, facilities management, financial management, administrative arrangements, insurance, and then over the top of that, there's an attempt to have kind of social justice, housing issues factored in as well. You don't get that kind of mix in many other forms of law and public policy, and yet self-management is attempting to give that very complex, very technical set of responsibilities to non-practitioners, to lay people. That's an incredibly complex and difficult task. There are some pretty severe consequences if a self-managed scheme gets it wrong. That's not to say there aren't those same consequences if there's a strata manager or other contractor, far from it. But at least in that case, those entities will have their own protections and their own processes for dealing with things. But if you're self-managing, you're the ones who are going to be up for those liabilities and up for those consequences. A very good and pertinent example of that is cladding. It may well be that you have a caretaker or strata manager or other contractor assisting the body corporate with their cladding responsibilities, and at least that can be kept at arm's length from you as an owner. But if you're self-managing, you're doing all that yourself and you bear the responsibility for it if, for whatever reason, those obligations are not met. One of the big things, and I've been talking to a couple of people in the strata industry this week about this webinar, and this issue came up a couple of times, is the lack of consistency and the lack of corporate knowledge and corporate history. So let's just say Joan from Unit 1 has been the scheme's secretary for 20 years or 30 years. And Joan, bless her heart, has been doing a great job. She's very efficient, very organised. And then Joan decides to move on. Joan decides to sell and take up a nice retired life on the coast. Suddenly, all of that corporate history and that consistency, particularly if there is no succession plan in place, is gone. And the scheme has to scramble to pick up the pieces, so to speak, and get on with it. That's very, very difficult to do when you're a layperson. And it also means there's a lot of time and a lot of responsibility put on volunteers. I do strata for a living, so does Nikki, but owners don't. Owners have day jobs. Owners have other lives to meet. If they're in the business of self-managing, that's an awfully big time commitment for people, and usually for no reward other than protecting their property. And I often say to people, particularly people who are on committees, being a volunteer in strata is just about the most thankless task that I can think of. You're dealing with a lot of demands. So the most simple way that I can articulate this one is that, let's just say you have a contractor who's coming on the site to do some work, whatever the work may be. It might be fairly basic stuff. In a self-managed situation, someone's got to be responsible for getting the quote. Someone's got to be responsible for managing the details of that quote. Someone's got to be responsible for executing the contract. Somebody's got to be responsible for paying it. Somebody's got to be responsible for being on site to have the contractor. Somebody's got to be responsible for allowing that contractor access to the different parts, particularly if they're locked or they're difficult to get to. Sometimes it might actually be within someone's lot. That is an awful lot to deal with for an individual who is not a day-to-day practitioner. So with all of that in mind then, is self-management a utopia? Sorry, is self-management a utopia? Well, yeah, I think it is. Strata Solve thinks it is. And why is that? Well, once upon a time, maybe it was achievable, and arguably it still is, but I think the only way self-management is really achievable these days is for relatively small schemes. Now, you can make a case to say that a fairly big scheme could self-manage as well, but think of it this way. So many strata schemes these days are like companies, multi-million-dollar budgets, facilities management, property management, maintenance, improvement, insurance, finances, audit. That is just about impossible to manage by the self. A small scheme, I think even 6 lots is probably a bit too much for self-management. A duplex, maybe, but I've got to tell you, when I was commissioner, the absolute worst disputes imaginable were duplexes over and over and over. As I say, I don't think this is the case anymore. I think once upon a time, government anticipated that it would be self-management, and there is this idea where all of the owners maybe meet up on the driveway, have a drink, cup of tea, a few biscuits, talk about what needs to be done, and away they go. I imagine there are still some schemes around that do it that way, and good on them for doing that. The vast majority, though, I just don't think that that's possible anymore. And that's because there are so many legislative and common law demands on strata. It's not just that strata laws change, it's laws very closely connected to strata laws change all the time. And then you're expecting people to be up to speed with that. At least with a strata manager, they have some obligations to continue to develop themselves and keep their knowledge up to date. And then there are the common law side of things, which, yeah, I think that's just about impossible for a self-managed scheme. People are also really litigious these days. If you're self-managing, you run the risk of people taking that very litigious mindset and putting it into place in your self-managed scheme. And like I said before, maybe it works for very small schemes, but I can think of plenty of small schemes where it would absolutely not work. I can sum it up this way. Why do you want the hassle? Why do you want those challenges? look, and again, I come back to the point I made not so long ago. Nikki and I do strata for a living, and there are many people who do strata for a living. Good on them for doing so. But if you don't, and all you want is just to make sure that your property is protected and your investment is protected, is that a hassle that you want? I can't imagine it is, frankly. So there are probably quite a few people listening to this or watching this who'll be reasonably outraged at this point and think, hang on, what does he know? Our scheme manages itself. We do just fine. And to which I would say, that's fantastic. Well done. You're the exception, if that's the case. So then, with all of that in mind, best practice. I always, when I talk about best practice, what I mean is there's legislation. The legislation tells you so much, and then the legislation stops. Then you have to figure it out yourself. That's what best practice is. So here's my best practice. And I think that this best practice applies whether you are self-managed or otherwise, or I'd like to think so anyway. First up, follow process and be methodical. When I was commissioner, I used to say to my staff all the time, because you wouldn't think it, but in that job, there are actually so many instances where you have to make a decision and it's not necessarily clear cut what that decision is. And I would always say to my staff, the instant we deviate from the path, the instant we deviate from our established practice, you can guarantee that's the instant where there's going to be a problem and where there's going to be a complaint. The same thing generally in strata. If you have a consistent, methodical process and you follow that process and you apply that process each time, the chances are that you will actually avoid problems that way. What do I mean by being methodical? It's about taking all of the necessary steps that you need to take in order to be transparent, to get things done. So an owner asks for permission for something, for example, can be anything. You would hope that the owner provides enough information at the start to make that decision, and away you go. But it may well be the owner's only provided a small amount of it. So what do you do at that point? Do you just simply dismiss that request and not follow it through? No, being methodical means that you actually ask for more information and you say, I don't have enough information on which to make a decision at this point. Can you please supply further information? That's what being methodical means. And it's also about a process, because the next step in the process is ideally you get the information, you have a basis on which to make a really informed, objective decision. Best practice 2. One of my favorites. Treat strata as a business and a series of transactions, and wherever possible, remove emotions. I know how difficult it is to remove emotion from strata because we're talking about your home and your investment. And I have seen people who, I've seen people, lawyers, judges, members of parliament, get very emotional and go too far in their discussions about strata. It's because it's their home. It's because it's theirs. They feel very strongly about it. You have to find a way to take the emotion out of the situation, because once emotion is there, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to be objective and to move forward. It's also about treating it as a business. So if you're a self-managed scheme, or if you're part of a self-managed scheme and you've got a situation in front of you, and you also happen to, say, run your own business or be part of a larger business, maybe sit back and think, okay, how would we treat this similar situation in my business? If there is, for example, a problem with an owner, or a problem with a contractor, a personality clash or a communication problem, in my business, how would I treat the similar situation with an employee? Apply that logic to the situation. Step 3, and I think best practice 3, and I think the most important one, is make a decision. Don't procrastinate. So many times I see people in strata, whether they be owners or whether they be committees, be afraid to make decisions. And I get it. Making decisions is scary stuff at the best of times. But when you're making a decision which has implications for how people live, how people do things, spending money, making decisions about property, that's confronting stuff because you are concerned about consequences. You are concerned about being held liable. And at the end of the day, you're concerned about being wrong. So I get why people procrastinate. I get why sometimes committees and owners put off making a decision. Understandable. But remember that strata is all about decision making. Every level of strata is about decision making at one point or another. If you are concerned about the decision that you are making or being asked to make, then go back to step one, follow process and be methodical. One of the best analogies that I give people who are concerned about decision making is this. In 6 months or 12 months time after your decision, if you're in the witness box in court or the adjudicator is asking you to make a submission on a strata dispute, can you look back at this moment and explain why you've made the decision that you've made? If you can do that, if you can look back and you can go, well, I made this decision because point 1, point 2, point 3, point 4, point 5, you are in a much better position to defend your decision making. Whereas if you're asked to defend your decision and all you can do is shrug your shoulders and go, well, I thought about, at the time it seemed like the right decision. It was just the vibe of the thing. That's not going to work. That's not going to cut it. So if you're concerned about decisions, gather information, and I'll go to another best practice tip that'll be useful for that in a moment, and then make the decision and be prepared to stand by it, but also be prepared to be flexible on the decision if something emerges that you find is actually relevant for the decision that you've made. It doesn't mean that you have to rescind it completely, but it can mean that you can make some adjustments to the decision. The worst thing that you can do, be it self-management or otherwise, is not make any decision at all, because then you're in limbo and literally nothing can get done under those circumstances. Point 4, you seek qualified advice as needed. You don't be a bush lawyer and you don't make assumptions. It's one of the biggest mistakes that you can make in strata. So if there's a water ingress problem, you get an engineer in or a plumber. If there are some issues around the sinking fund or around the accounts, you might want to get an accountant on board. Want some legal advice? You ask a lawyer. Got a situation with dispute resolution? You might ask a consultant who has some expertise in dispute resolution. The point being here that you can't rely upon your assumptions and you can't rely upon the whim of the situation. When you get qualified advice, that helps you make the right decisions in pretty much every case. And I suppose that's one of the key points that we're talking about today about self-management. Self-management doesn't mean that you can't get any kind of input from anyone. Far from it. You can be self-managed and rely upon assistance from other parties in that process, but you've got to make sure that they know what they're talking about. Best practice point number 5, this is more a reminder than anything. Your motivation, your end game here is protecting your investment. That's what being in strata is all about. You don't get involved in strata for the hell of it or for a joyride. You're doing it because you have invested time and money into property. You have to protect that investment and ideally you grow that investment. So all your decision making should be underpinned by that. And then finally, be resilient. Strata is tough work. Sometimes it really can be difficult. And there are times, and I've seen it happen where people don't want to continue, don't want to persist, don't want to follow through an issue because it's difficult, it's time consuming, it costs money. All of that's understandable. So at the outset, and I say this to every client I speak to just about, are you resilient enough to see this through? There is always an option to solve every strata problem and every strata situation. Always, there always is. But you have to be prepared to take the option. And being prepared to take the option means that you have to be resilient, because sometimes it might take an awfully long time and it'll wear you down. If you're resilient enough to do it, that means generally that you're confident enough to do it. It doesn't necessarily mean that you'll get 100% of what you want every time, but it means you'll get it more often than not. That is it for my presentation proper. Time for questions.
Thanks so much, Chris. That was really interesting. And I've got a couple of things I thought, well, that sort of pinged in my head when you were speaking. And one of them was, you spoke about the legislation and how complicated it all is. And I'd just like to say to everybody, from LookUpStrata's point of view, when we started very naively back in 2012, we thought that we could have a site that had a very, very few posts on it that sort of handle, so you have a Queensland pet post that would handle all of the questions that anyone had about pets in Queensland, and that would be it. And then as we've gone on, obviously, we do Q&As all of the time. You help us with a lot of those. We've seen, so we've been doing Q&As probably for maybe 7 years now, and we get about 200 questions a month from across Australia. And some of those are the same, and we can point people to questions that you've answered and other people have answered for us, but very regularly they're not the same, and they're new issues that we're having coming up every day. So who would think that 7 years down the track with that volume of questions, we would still have a situation where we're getting new questions come up, and some of them, as you know, don't have an answer to them either, and you have to get back to people, and you haven't really got a response that can solve the issue for them. It's just a matter of continuing to look for an answer.
Yeah, absolutely, Nikki. It's a really good point. Here's a fun fact for everybody. Somebody that I work with up here in Queensland in the strata sector, as an exercise, did an analysis of Queensland's legislation, and I think came up with that there are 80,000 words in Queensland's Act and modules. Good luck navigating through that. And I suppose the other analogy I give to people is that, again, going back to when I was commissioner in Queensland, the people who worked in that office were some of the most knowledgeable people about strata on the face of the earth, literally. People who'd been practicing in it for 20 years or more. And yet those same people would have disputes, arguments with each other about the meaning of different sections. And when I say arguments, Nikki, they were arguments. And I always say to people, if that's what you get from experts, then it's really, really tough for the layperson as well. It doesn't mean that you can't form a view. It doesn't mean that you can't interpret. Far from it. Go for your life. But you've got to remember that there are many layers and many nuances to it. Always seek qualified advice when you can.
Definitely. And we've had comments come through, and unfortunately, due to time, we probably can't go through each and every one of them in detail. But if you have had an experience with self-managing, or you've looked into it and you've had some sort of outcome from it, certainly share it with the group, because I'm sure people are reading it. But we've had comments come through from some people saying they're doing it quite successfully. It's running really well. It might be like a 48 lotter. I think I saw an even larger one in there from WA as well. And it does work for them and it works great. And then we've had other people comment in there that they've tried it and they've had so many problems with it and they've had issues with it. But we have had a couple that I'll probably just read out to you anyway that I've picked out while I was in there. So we had a comment come in from Sarah, who is a strata manager in Victoria, and she's just saying, in our experience, when we've taken over from a self-managed strata, we've seen OCs use funds incorrectly when reading the plan of subdivision wrong.
Yeah, look, that's a big one, Nikki, and those plans of subdivision are really important because they determine where maintenance responsibilities lie within the strata scheme. And it can very well be the case that if you're not fully up to speed with who is meant to be responsible for what, then you can have a situation where the strata scheme or the owners corporation or the body corporate has spent money where they should not have spent money. That then leaves open the possibilities of recovery. It also, but more than that, I think it leaves open the prospect of a very, very rude shock for people later on when things start getting done the right way. And suddenly it's, whoa, where did this bill come from? We haven't been doing that. And I don't know what the case is in other states, but I know in Queensland, adjudicators have a very, very strong view that just because something was done one way in the past does not mean it continues to be done that way in the future, particularly if it was wrong in the first place.
Yes, okay. And we've also had a question, another comment, I think it was from Sarah, it might be the same Sarah, I'm not sure, but she's just saying, how can you seek qualified advice when you self-manage? Have investigated there is no other way than to sign up with a strata manager. Oh no, this is a Sarah from Sydney, so sorry, New South Wales.
Look, it's like any decision that you make. Every decision that a strata scheme makes has its genesis in legislation. The legislation tells you what decisions can be made by what entity. Usually it's based upon a dollar value. Sometimes it's based upon the importance of the decision as well. So if you need legal advice, for example, it's the same as if you're getting a plumber in, and that's not to insult either plumbers or lawyers. I'm just making the comparison. You get a quote, you look at the quote, you make sure that it's fit for purpose, you make sure it's actually delivering what it is that you need. Then you determine, has that been budgeted for? Is there the money for that? Is it within the appropriate spending limit? Okay, yes, decide, vote, done. That's how the decision gets made. In a self-managed scheme, that doesn't mean that decision-making goes out the window and any one person can make decisions on behalf of everyone else. That's not what I'm saying at all. There is a process that still needs to be worked through. And even at its most simple, I would suggest to Sarah I would be saying that even if that scheme was in a really bad way and, bad record keeping, whatever, even the simplest thing could be to just have owners vote by email. That is one of the ways you restart or reset the situation.
Okay, thank you. And we just, we recorded a session. It wasn't a webinar, but it was a recorded session with Sedgwick quite a while ago. And it was basically all about scope of works and how important it is to get a scope of works that everyone agrees to. And so if anyone is organising to get quotes done, they might want to have a look at that video because it will be very helpful for them. And I'll include a link in the email that goes out later today, so you can take a look at that as well. And that will give you some guidelines. But we did also record a session last week with Leanne Habib from Premium Strata. It was a New South Wales session, but it was all about how the strata manager assists committees when they're going through difficult times. And that was one of the things she did mention quite regularly during the presentation about how important it is to know when to get a specialist in and what specialists actually get in at that point.
I might just pick up on that point, Nikki, because maybe what that person and a few other people are sort of getting at is like actually appointing a strata manager to help, but not actually be managed technically by the strata manager. So just to clarify what we mean there, and again, I can only speak from a Queensland legislation perspective, but in Queensland, when you appoint a strata manager, you appoint them for 1 year or you appoint them for 3 years. That's it. There are no options. In fact, there was a very recent adjudication order in Queensland which made it quite clear that any strata manager who is offering their services on a month-to-month basis, which I know sometimes happens, they shouldn't be doing it. It's not consistent with legislation to do it that way. That doesn't mean, for example, that a strata manager cannot assist pro bono. That happens a lot too. And they do it obviously for a commercial motivation. They hope to eventually be appointed as the strata manager. Well and good. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to get a strata manager in. Like I said before, it might mean legal advice, it might mean an accountant, it might mean an engineer, it might mean a consultant. Those people don't have those same obligations in terms of engagement that maybe a strata manager has. And if I could just pick up on that point as well, I see a comment there from John. John, nice to hear and see from you again. John asked just to clarify the differences when I talk about the phrase strata manager. So John, yes, I do mean a body corporate manager. So the strata manager, this is a very, very simplified way of describing it. The strata manager is responsible for the administrative side of the scheme. So levies, notices, meetings, and so on. The on-site manager or the caretaker is the person who is appointed by the body corporate to do work around the building, and it's a defined set of tasks that they have. So that's what I mean. So when I say strata manager, yes, I'm absolutely talking about body corporate manager, and they do have very different roles, John. You're quite right.
And when you say an assigned set of tasks as well, Chris, I mean, the committee can negotiate that with the strata manager as well, can't they? So you can have a strata manager that basically, if you haven't got a strong committee or you've got people that aren't interested in the building to manage that, then the strata manager can basically do all of that for you. Or there are other instances where you've got buildings that have quite a strong committee and so I guess it's another sort of model we can look at too. So the committee is quite active. They're doing a lot of the role themselves. They're happy to do that, but then they might have a strata manager in a role that's negotiated to be there, but not support them as much as they do in other buildings.
And Nikki, looking at some of the comments that have come through, one of the consistent themes that I can see is people talking about what to do when you've got a self-managed scheme that for different reasons it's not worked out or it's not working out. Someone there's mentioned a very difficult situation with a boundary wall. They described it as a disaster, and there are a few other similar situations. So again, speaking from the Queensland perspective, and I dare say there are similarities in other states and territories, it's pretty not common, but it's something which happens where if you've had a scheme which has gone along for a while, not being consistent with legislation, not doing the right thing in a bit of a difficult state, typically what happens is that an administrator gets appointed, and the administrator's job is to get things back on track. The administrator, one of the typical things an administrator does is to convene, hold a general meeting, and then hopefully they'll get people appointed to a committee, strike some levies, and then the administrator basically hands the building back to the owners and says, okay, owners, away you go. I've got this back on track for you. The administrator can be different qualifications. I'm an administrator for a couple of schemes. Body corporate managers are frequently administrators. Lawyers can be administrators. Accountants can be administrators. It's very similar to appointing a receiver for a corporation. Get it back on track, get it working.
Excellent. It's good to see that there are a few different options out there as well. Now, we did have questions that came in, which we haven't even gotten to yet. We've been having this chat and we're coming up to the end of the session, so we better dive into a couple of the submitted questions before we go. So one of them was, this one's from Michelle, and we thought that we'd start off with this one because it was a good one to sort of leap off from. I'm a lot owner, and due to a recent casual vacancy, chairperson, our secretary who has been at the helm for approximately 40 years is retiring. Yep. We will form an entire new committee with a few people interested in positions and the same positions. My question is about the roles of the new committee members. In your experience, how well functioning is a committee if they share roles, or should their roles be strictly adhered to for the best of all, the better of all?
Yeah, it's a good question. So again, in Queensland, one person can hold all three executive roles if that's the way it works out. So one person can be chairperson, secretary, treasurer. That happens quite a bit. And the legislation allows for that because it recognises that sometimes you won't get people putting their hands up. So it's good from that perspective. Where it becomes a bit problematic, I think, is just simply the demands on that person to fulfil all of those roles. Being treasurer, secretary, chairperson of themselves aren't necessarily demanding things. You have set tasks at set times, and that's that. When you're doing all three things at once, that's 3 times as many responsibilities to begin with. But I think more than that, others in the scheme would then start to look at you as being that person. You're the person who does everything. That places a lot of pressure on the individual, and it also gets away from the idea that strata is a group concept, because it's group decision making. So if one person's got all three roles, even though that's efficient and necessary in the situation, it would be a lot better if there could be at least one other person involved. It just simply takes a bit of pressure off the other person. In the situation that you described there in that question, Nikki, the other issue that scheme's going to face is that you hope and pray that that person who's been at the helm for 40 years has maintained good records, good files. Hopefully they have, and in which case you just simply take that over and keep going with it. You might make a bit of fine tuning, you might tweak it a little bit, but if they've been keeping things on the back of an envelope for 40 years, that's going to be a big challenge at that point. Yeah.
If that knowledge is living inside their head, or rather than
that was my comment about Joan from lot 1. If Joan moves on, that's that. You have to hope that they have left some good records for you. And if they haven't left good records, or there are no records at all, you're going to have to start again, basically. Yep. And that's a huge thing to do. Huge
Definitely, definitely. Okay. And I think we've had a discussion, it probably was a few years ago, about putting that hat of committee member on as well, rather than lot owner, and how human nature might fail a little bit there, because you're
absolutely,
making decisions,
Nikki.
for the best of the building and not the best of yourself. If you're one person doing all three roles and there's sort of no other checks in there.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we get to the other questions submitted, Nikki, I just want to follow up one point I raised just a few minutes ago, because I see there's been a comment there from Marina. Yes, Marina, that's right. When the strata manager's term is up, they should not be contracted month to month thereafter. I know why it happens. I know it happens. It shouldn't happen. Technically, shouldn't happen.
So that's just in Queensland, Chris, at this point, and we'll have to seek clarification outside of Queensland.
Yeah, and look, it's a really problematic situation, because there are plenty of situations where you'd have a body corporate manager who would want a strata manager just for a short period, just as a bridging thing. Maybe just to provide a few services, just a smooth over a transition, perhaps, do a discrete task. Well and good, but they're not meant to be the appointed strata manager.
Okay, thank you. All right, we might jump back into another question we had so this one's from New South Wales, Leone. How will the new Strata Hub and annual reporting affect self-managed schemes?
So I wouldn't profess to be the expert on that new regime, but my understanding of it is that New South Wales have initiated a system whereby all strata schemes are meant to lodge certain documents, I think on an annual basis. So basically a form of annual return. In one way, I think it's really good, because my understanding is that the point of it is to try and create that central repository of information, which is sometimes lacking. So that's really good. The difficulty for a self-managed scheme is that, again, you are relying upon that scheme to, first of all, know that that actually is happening. And not everybody knows, not everybody reads the news. And then the second part of that, you're then relying upon them to comply. So knowing about it and complying with it, two very different things. I'm not sure if there are any penalties for not complying, but that would be one of the consequences at the very least.
Okay, and we're just to let you know, Leon, we've got an article coming out in Monday's newsletter from Perrette Corey that has quite a bit of detailed information about the hub and what you need to do. And we have published other articles as well, so we do have a little bit of information on there. And I think New South Wales Fair Trading's got quite a good guidance page as well that you can look at. So that's just some information on that. Then we've had one from Rhiannon from Queensland. She is a strata manager. This is quite a good point. My question relates to self-managed schemes that have made the decision to engage a manager. What are some tips for encouraging previous self-managed schemes to increase their very low sinking fund levies and to start actively improving their building?
It's a great question, Rhiannon. Without going into details, I'm grappling with this situation myself with a client at the moment, and it's not going to be pretty when the levy notice gets sent out. Let's just put it that way. In terms of encouraging, I always think the best way is to bring it back to first principles, Rhiannon. And that first principle is always the same, protection and growth of an investment. So yes, you're going to be up for a higher levy. That's bad news, particularly in the current economic climate. But we're doing it because it increases the value of your property. So we are, and it might be a good idea to use an example, Rhiannon, when you're doing that communication, or when the committee is doing that communication. So one of the reasons why your levies are so high this time is because we need to do significant work on the pool. And you might say to me, I don't care about the pool. Well, the pool is one of the things which will contribute to the value of the scheme. So that's why we are doing it. I would focus more on those benefits and those positives rather than the negative side of things, which is, oh, well, we have to do it. Oh, well, we're obliged to do it. Oh, well, we might get in trouble if we don't. Those are relevant and true. Focus on the benefits and the positives.
Yeah, excellent. Great advice. I like that one. Okay, we had one from Janet. I live in a block of 3 detached houses. I'm not sure which state this is from, but I think it can probably be applicable for multiple states anyway, Chris.
I think so.
A new owner has bought in and caused chaos with our strata management, who were glad to get rid of us. Lot 3 insisted we self-manage. I hesitated for months, but due to no fees being paid, I reluctantly agreed. Lot 3 is secretary. Lot 1, me, is the treasurer, and Lot 2 is not interested in any aspects of the complex, like paying for fees or maintaining the property. I've stressed the importance of a sinking fund. We currently have a zero balance and our levy notices are all over the place. Can I insist on a professional strata management company? Can the secretary send out invoices without the treasurer's knowledge? And can they do a budget to suit themselves and not do it and not the property? And we can't seem to be able to work together.
Yeah, look, Janet, difficult situation. I think you hit upon one of the key points right at the start. When it comes to self-management, I'll share this anecdote first, Nikki. It's one of my favourite ever strata anecdotes, and then I'll answer the question. I was at a seminar, delivered the seminar, and then as happens at those seminars, you stick around and people ask you questions and chit-chat. At one event I did a couple of years ago, someone came up to me and they said, "Oh, Chris, how often do we need to hold an annual general meeting?" And I had to really stop and think about this. And I thought, is this a trick question? Is there something I'm missing here? It turns out that in that self-managed scheme, the owners had decided that things were chugging along just fine. They'd meet every 2 years, not every year. So that was their definition of an AGM. So then I had to say, look, you technically should be doing this every year. And they went, okay. My point being, and I made this, then I then followed up, and this is where it gets to your question, Janet. That's fine. You can keep doing it every 2 years. No one's going to check it. There's no police doing that. But the instant somebody new moves in and demands things be done the right way, that's when it has to change. You've got no option then. That's exactly what's happened here, Janet. Somebody has moved in and is wanting things done the right way. So, Janet, in answer to your questions, can you insist upon a professional strata management company? No one person can make that insistence, Janet. It's usually a group decision. Can the secretary send out invoices without the treasurer's knowledge? It shouldn't happen that way because, again, if you're a committee, you're supposed to be making those decisions jointly. Can they do a budget to suit themselves and not the property? Again, no, they shouldn't be doing it that way. It should be for the benefit of the entire property. We can't seem to be able to work together. Janet, I'd be saying to you that if you can't get some kind of basis for agreement here, if you can't get things back on track, you're probably going to have to seek some intervention, I think, and that will be that administrator arrangement that I spoke about earlier. That's the consequence of an administrator, means that you lose your rights as an owner too. You don't get any voting rights at that point. So that's a big step. You might want to make that point to your fellow owners and say, the next step here is somebody doing this for us, but we'll be up for a huge cost and we will lose all of our ability to vote. So that's a good motivation for trying to sort things out, I would have thought.
Okay, now we might throw a bit of positivity in here now because we've got sort of delved into a few negative situations, but we've had a comment come in from Susan and she's saying we've found self-managing has made things easier in that it's helped networking within the complex. So we now know who owns, who the tenants are, who can head off issues, and issues are less messy than we have now that we have direct contact with people. So that's a positive. Yeah,
that's awesome. Yeah, great. More power to you, Susan. I hope it continues.
Okay, and we might just have one more because we're running out of time rapidly. And this was from Margaret, and it's a 2-lot duplex strata scheme in New South Wales. And she asks, we recently changed from a strata manager to self-managing our 2-lot strata. Both owners agreed to this and they're willing to work together. But where do we start and how do we know what needs to be done?
I think your first place to start is always with records, Margaret. So the body corporate records are the basis on which everything that has happened and therefore will happen in future proceeds. So if you haven't already obtained the records from your strata manager, you need to get your hands on the records, and that's all records. Probably the most important record of all is the bank account details, I would have thought, Margaret. Again, in Queensland, there's a form for that purpose where the strata manager is no longer involved. The form is submitted to the bank, and then that cuts off the strata manager's access to the account at that point. So those would be the very first two things that you need to do: records, bank accounts. Then After that, where do you start? I think the most basic thing that you do is that it's great that you've come to the agreement, great that you're willing to work together. The cynic in me knows that that might not last forever. So you keep everything in writing. Everything that you agreed to, make a note of it. Even if you have a discussion and make an agreement over the back fence, go back inside, write it up, put it in an email to your owner next door. Hi, Janice, thanks very much for the discussion. As we agreed, we are now going to do this with the gardens. It's there on file. That is your most basic way of safeguarding all of those decisions that you get made. And then the next point, go back to those best practice points I raised before, but I think in your case, the best one of all will be seek qualified advice as you need to. So unless the two of you are engineers or lawyers or strata managers for that matter, you will want to seek qualified advice to step you through some of the trickier parts of the process. Good on you for getting to that point though. Best of luck with that.
Great, really good advice there, Chris. That's really great, and yeah, good to see that it's working well and that they're looking for places to go, and there is support out there as well. So the other thing you might want to look at is your chapter of SCA in your state. Usually runs lot owner. It might be online. I know they did a lot face to face, but it's kind of slowed down. But it's starting to pick up again in the different states. So keep an eye out for what's happening. We very regularly list them in the bottom of our upcoming events section at the bottom of the newsletter. So you can keep up to date there as to what's happening, but they're really great sessions. Some of them you can just do online as well. You don't actually, you can just jump on today and start doing the information they've got, running through the information that they've got there. So that's a good resource as well.
Yep, absolutely.
All right, I think we're just about coming up to the end of the session. People are popping comments in to say thanks so much, informative discussion. So thank you for your feedback. If you've got feedback about the session, we'd really love to see it. We do tend to share some of that feedback in the email that goes out later today. So we thank you for that. So yeah, if you did submit a question, I mean, I know we had lots happening in the chat, and as always, we've run out of time, but if you submitted a question and you're still waiting for a response to it, feel free to jump onto the LookUpStrata site and go to the Ask a Strata question page, and you can submit your question that way, as you probably have done before, because we have so many questions coming in, and then we'll send that off to either Chris or someone else if it's not relevant to the discussion today. We've had a few things that were slightly off topic, so we'll see how we go getting those responses back to you. Now, at the end of the session, we always like to ask our presenters if they've got some news to share with us, some win or something that's happening in the industry that they'd like to let us know about. So it's the nitty-gritty at the end of the show.
Yeah, look, interestingly, Nikki, we do this presentation only a couple of days after the Queensland state budget, and state budgets are usually a bit of a non-event when it comes to the very specific world of strata. Not this time. Strata got a look in a few different ways. It seems as though the Commissioner's Office, my old stomping ground, will get some much needed additional resources. For people familiar with the Commissioner's Office, they are utterly swamped with demands, so that is a positive. We've also had an amendment bill introduced into Parliament 2 days ago to cover a very, very specific set of situations for some buildings in Queensland, which is probably the subject of a whole other webinar. So that's happening. The government has renewed its commitment to the reform process that they've already started, and I'm part of that reform process along with a few other people that you might have seen on some LookUpStrata webinars. So that's good. So that's been an interesting development, Nikki. It is sometimes difficult to get politicians engaged with strata issues because they don't think it's overly sexy and exciting. And yet, as we well know, Nikki, literally millions of people have a very strong stake in how strata pans out.
Definitely, more and more people every day, I think. So that's good. That's really great news. We send lots of people to the Commissioner's Office when we can't help them anymore. If we've reached our limit of being able to assist, we certainly suggest that they give the Commissioner's Office a call. So we're sending people there all the time, and that's great to hear that that's being supported, because I know it's a resource that's fantastic that Queensland has that there. I'm really, really happy about that. And yeah, well, obviously, maybe you can let me know about the other matters that you spoke about with the buildings, and we can do something about that as well. But yeah, that sounds good. All right, excellent. Thank you for sharing that information with us. So just a really big thank you again to you, Chris. I know dedicate a lot of your time to helping people out in the industry, and we're very happy to be able to put that information out there for everyone, and very happy for your input that you give us in these sessions, and also just regularly on the LookUpStrata site and all of our publications that we push out. So thanks everyone again for joining us for this hour. We've just gone over time. It's been a pleasure, Chris, as always, and really enjoyed the discussion.
Thanks very much, Nikki. And again, thanks very much everybody for taking the time to be present. Much appreciated.
Excellent. All right, we'll see you in the near future.
See you all.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us for this educational session. If you gained value from the information, please like this video. You can also engage further with LookUpStrata by subscribing to our YouTube channel, or by being kept informed about Strata news via our regular newsletters. Our subscribe link is listed in the description box below.